Come join us each week as we dive into topics about the joys and the struggles of motherhood. By no means are we experts. We're practically flying by the seat of our pants, or should I say, mom jeans. On this podcast, you will find a judgment-free zone where we discuss not only the best parts of being a mom, but the not-so-glamorous parts too. You can expect unfiltered, real mom talk, humor, grace, and a sense of sisterhood. What makes our podcast unique is that we understand there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to being a mother. We're not going to pretend that we know everything too, because we definitely don't. We just want a place to share our stories with you. Thank you so much for tuning in to Mom Jeans, trying to fit into motherhood.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 11 of Mom Jeans, the podcast. Before we dive in, we're so excited to break that 10 episode milestone. We unexpectedly did last week because we got into such good conversation and deep conversation that we split it into 2 episodes. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But while we're here, if you've enjoyed our podcast, give it a rating, give it 5 stars. It really helps us grow. And we really appreciate that. So with that, let's dive into episode 11. It's a very important episode because we're going to talk about Lisa's birth story. But first, I wanted to just share a quick update. If you listen to episode 10, you'll know that it ended really emotionally in, I think, a raw and real way, right? We tackled the conversation, especially, I think, between everybody here, but I think between Lisa and I are really around how to navigate seeing motherhood from such close proximity and the inevitability of comparing, and also understanding like how we navigate it all together. And it's hard. It's beautiful to go through this so closely, but it also makes it really hard. And then to talk through it in such good detail. So that was my perspective on how we tackled last week. I guess I wanted to give an update, and then I'll pass it to Lisa, that because we live literally proximity so close, that night we met in the backyard in our living room, and we gave each other the biggest hug. We chatted it out, and we really had a really good conversation and have been hanging out all week, and things are great. But it was just a really raw and important conversation. But Lisa, I'd be curious if you have any more to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. It was totally unexpected for me to have had that reaction. Like I said, like I don't get emotional for things like that. That's just not my nature. And I think for some reason it just hit a spot of like, man, I'm going through this motherhood thing of 2 kids, and there are days that I feel just deflated and kicked and down, and it's really hard. And I want some appreciation. I'm definitely an appreciation person. And when I felt like, there's a lot of stigma on being able to have a baby vaginally, and I didn't have that. And for some reason, it makes me feel a little bit lesser. It doesn't really make much sense, but Michelle and I had a good conversation. Like she said, we cut a door in our fence so that we can go between each other's houses, more so for our dogs, but so that we can go to each other's houses quickly. And I ran over there and we talked for a bit, and it's difficult. It's like Michelle said, and we've talked about before on past episodes. I was shocked that Aubrey was a girl, and I thought I was going to have a boy. And I had a little bit of a mourning period over that. And Michelle is having a boy after having a girl. And, for her, obviously she's thrilled for herself, but she felt some sense of bad because I didn't get that. And that's the last thing that I want for any of you guys. And we've talked about that is just because I didn't get what I said I wanted doesn't mean I can't be happy for you too. I don't ever want you to feel badly or guilty that you're getting, what you want. So Michelle and I had a conversation about that because I'm super excited for them. And like we see each other probably 4 to 5 times a week easily. So we're going to get to see her baby boy grow up and see how, we get to see Wesson and Weston. And that's different for me because I have girls, and I'm so, like I said, I took a little bit of a mourning period to get over, like, okay, I'm never going to have a boy, and that's okay. But I love our family. I love having the two girls, and I always wanted a sister myself. And it's going to be really cool to, see them grow up together as sisters, because that's something I didn't have and I wanted, and I'm excited to see how that goes. So yes, two things can be true at the same time. You can be sad for yourself and happy for others, and that's okay. So I'm glad we had that episode. I do think that opened up a lot of doors to be able to be honest with each other and have those hard conversations. So we appreciate you guys listening and allowing us to have that space. And I told Leah, man, I was an ugly crier. We were looking at the video. She's like, who isn't an ugly crier? I will say, when your kids are having tantrums, it's kind of funny. It's kind of cute.
Lisa, I do have maybe a difficult question for you. Because you said that you feel lesser, or like that triggered you to feel lesser when you had a C-section.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think of other women who had a C-section as lesser then? Because I'm just thinking,
Not
like,
at all.
I had a C-section too, but I don't see it that way. And,
Yeah, no, I don't see it that way either. I think, and we'll get into my birth story. I think that I grew up in a very competitive lifestyle growing up, and some of my best friends were able to have vaginal births, and it was almost like, well, you don't understand. Like, no, I don't understand. You're right. But that doesn't mean that I had, lesser of an experience. It was I don't know. You're right. I don't think of anybody else that had a C-section as lesser. I don't know. It's weird. It's hard to put
Lisa,
into words.
I had a really hard time too, like with, because I had a C-section too, and it wasn't like what I planned. And I get what you're saying. Like, I get it a lot. Because when I see like, oh, you had like a vaginal birth and it went smoothly, and it's just like, man, did some of the choices that I made, is that, why I ended up having to have a C-section. And so I'm still a year out, so questioning those things. But also, we're strong too. Like, the healing process after that, it took a lot, our girl just had a baby in 6 weeks, she's already back working out at the HIIT classes. And I was like, it took me a long time to recover before I could like be back and lifting weights. And so it's just kind of like, man, I mean, not a setback, but like just not what I expected. So I get where you're coming from, if that makes sense.
It's really strange, because it's like going in, like, I didn't have a birth plan, and I wasn't like, oh no, I can't have a C-section. Like, if I need to have a C-section, let's have a C-section. So like, that's the weird thing, right? Like, I don't know why that hit that way. I don't know why I feel that way, because I don't know. I don't know how to put it into words. Like, I don't have therapy for another month, so I'm not able to unpack it until then. But, that's certainly something that I will unpack with my therapist, of like, hey, why do you think I had that reaction? That was weird, right? So
yeah, that'd be interesting. You have to let us know. Like,
yeah, I will.
Because I'm really curious. Yeah.
Yeah, because like I don't feel like I don't know.
No, I was just gonna say, I do want to deeply apologize for using the word easy. Like, that was absolutely the wrong word to use. I do think, like, in the middle of the big push and the blood patch and all these things, like, yeah, I think that the C-section did feel like an escape route, if you may, versus like the easy route. And so it was the wrong choice of words that to use that. It is by no means an easier path. It might be like I don't know if simpler. I can't even pick. I don't want to dig myself into another hole too. But, right?
It's quicker.
Like, it's quicker. Yeah, right. Like, there's those types of things, right? It just, anyways. I'm really grateful we have that science. I think it's fascinating that just looking up the stats. On average, 30% of women have a C-section.
Hmm.
The fact that 75% of us, and I probably should have had one, is really interesting too.
I'm surprised that number's that low, to be honest with you, because of how many people I know that have had C-sections. That's amazing.
Yeah, me
Yeah,
too.
there's a 2022 stat,
Well, no,
which is interesting.
I believe you. I mean,
Yeah.
I
No,
probably
agree.
because 75% of us on this
Yeah.
cast of having
So
kids
close to it.
had a C-section. I just
Yeah. But anyways, it was absolutely the wrong word. And I just want to genuinely apologize to all of you and to others listening.
You absolutely do not need to apologize. I can't even imagine pushing a baby out of my vagina. Like,
no,
that
no,
just is so
no.
scary to me.
I
Like,
can't imagine it.
and the healing, yeah, I mean, I feel like that took a lot too to like heal, and I just can't even imagine. So I don't even know. I have no words. So that's amazing that you did that, and that is awesome.
Birth is hard, and there's side effects, long-term effects, no matter which way you birth a child.
Yeah. Totally. And if you had a textbook, congratulations.
I just want to say thank you to Lisa and Michelle for being willing to have that like raw, hard, unfiltered conversation, especially in this setting. Obviously, that was a really personal, intimate conversation, really between the two of you. But the fact that we were all here and all of our listeners got to experience it, that it's this situation is just you guys, but this situation is not just limited to you two. So I think it just goes to show, like, have those hard conversations and figure out the right way to approach it, and just know that you're not alone. And even if you might feel silly about your feelings, they're still your feelings, and they're probably not silly. And you're probably going to feel a lot better if you just talk about it. So kudos to you guys. It's not an easy thing to do, but I'm proud of you both. I'm proud of all of you.
Well, on that note, we can close episode 10 and move on to episode 11. I love you, Lisa. I love you, Leah. I love you, Danielle. I love you, Michaela. And I'm really glad we got to go there.
I think it's time to move into our main topic. And Lisa, I'm going to kick it over to you to hear all about your birth story that I know what I could share from my side of things, but I'm excited to hear your perspective from your story, and we can, just explore this whole motherhood thing, the fact that all journeys are different, so very different. You can say that 3 out of the 4 of you guys have had a C-section, but every single story is so wildly different. So without further ado, let's hear it, Lisa.
Yeah, I was just reviewing my notes. I wrote down notes a couple of weeks ago just to try to remember some things. So I had 2 very different birth experiences based on the 2 girls. So Hannah, my oldest, the first. So she was born in January during COVID time. So we were told we were going to go into the hospital and have to have a mask on during the birthing process. And I was like, yeah, right. Like, you're going to tell pregnant birthing mother that she has to wear a mask while she's like, yeah, right. Okay, whatever. So that was like a stressor for me going into the hospital. And I remember asking the doctor, like, do I really have to wear a mask? And she's like, yes, like kind of like wink, wink. Yes, you do. But when I got into the hospital, I was like, listen, I'm really stressed about this. They're like, oh, don't worry. We haven't enforced, like, when you're actually like actively laboring, you won't have to wear a mask. And I was like, okay, could you have told me that before I got here? That would have helped a lot, but we'll go back then.
Before, when they were telling you that you were going to have to wear a mask, were they, at that point, were they saying that Brandon would or would not be allowed in the room with you?
He'd be allowed. Nobody else was going to be allowed to come visit us or anything like that. Like, we didn't know, and we'll get to this, but like, they were like, you can only bring 1 bag. We're pretty strict on like what you're bringing in because we're concerned about the germs coming in. And, it was still like in the time when they were like not knowing what was passing COVID on, really. So that was like kind of a weird experience, right? Because we were like, okay. And then they told us once we got there, we weren't going to be able to leave. So it was like, all right, no big deal. You know, if you have a vaginal birth, you're in and out in 24 hours. We can make that work, right? Like that's fine. They have a cafeteria. Brandon would have to pay for 2 meals, but we would survive. We brought a bunch of snacks. We were prepared on that front, as far as that goes. Yeah, once we're kind of jumping all over the place, but like once we got there, they were like, okay, you can't leave your room. And it was like, oh, like we're literally trapped in the room. Like I can't go walk around. Like I can't go try to like, you know, make this progress. It's really interesting. Like we felt pretty confined, but you know, it was what it was. Like it was, you know, like we talked about with Leah, like she didn't get to go into labor. And the night before we went to the hospital, I did have contractions, and I was having contractions for probably about 2 hours, but they weren't close enough together that we were like, oh yeah, it's time to go. But they were uncomfortable, but not terrible. Like I was like, all right, interesting. Cause at this point I was a week early. I would have been a week early if I went into labor that day. And then like they went away, and I was like, all right, no big deal. So I was still working at this point, and I told my boss that morning, I was like, I think I'm going to stay home today. Like I had contractions last night. I'm a little bit nervous. I'm going to work from home. So I was working from home, and I like kept feeling like something was going to happen. Like I was excited. I was like, oh my gosh, like, is it happening? Is it happening? Nothing happened during that day. And then 10 p.m. hit, and I started having contractions, and I was like, oh boy, these are contractions. Like I was feeling it, and I hadn't packed my hospital bag at this point, because I was like, if I pack my hospital bag, I'm going to go into labor, and I don't want to induce labor because I'm so terrified of having this baby. So I started having contractions, and then I went into like, all right, I'm going to go pack because this is it. I feel it. This is it. So Brandon started like downloaded one of those apps, and we were counting contractions, and they started getting closer together, and we were like, all right, you know, the 511 rule of having what is it? 5 minutes, 1 minute of contractions for 1 hour. I don't know, whatever. So we got like right to it, and I was like, let's just go to the hospital. And at this point it was like midnight. I think we checked in right at midnight at the hospital. So the drive to the hospital, it was like the anticipation was so great, but I was also like, this is kind of painful. Like, let's just get to the hospital. And so I get there, and, you know, of course, like the fear a little bit is like, you're going to get to the hospital and then they're going to send you back home. So I was like, should we have waited longer? Like, who knows? But we went, and I get there, and they're like, yep, you're dilated. I think at that point I was like 4 centimeters. So I was like, all right, good. Wow. They're not going to kick me out. So that was good. And they get me checked into the room, and we're all excited. And they come in, and they're like doing their checks, and they're like, oh man, you're going to have this baby by 7 a.m. And again, we got in at midnight, and I was like, well, that would be so awesome if we could have this baby that fast. Like, I'm so excited. So we kept going, and I think I got to like 7 centimeters, and I was like, at epidural time, I'm feeling it. Like, this is getting rough. Like, I'm not enjoying this. And that was probably like, I want to say like 5 a.m. So I was like, all right, well, I have 2 more hours and this baby's coming out. That's what they said. I'm going to have this baby before shift change. And then they kept coming in, and they're like, we're going in the wrong direction. I'm like, what? What does that mean? They said, yeah, sometimes the epidural kind of slows everything down. I was like, why didn't you tell me that before? Like, maybe I wouldn't have done an epidural if that's what happens. And I don't know if that's true science, or if they were just trying to make me feel better, or what the ideal was there. But yeah, so that's kind of where that went. And so then we were kind of just sitting around waiting, and I would say like pretty soon after the epidural came, like I started to go into this haze of like, I was very cloudy minded. Like, I was aware, I was excited, but I was also like in a daze. And my normal? Epidural, I don't know. I don't know if that's normal.
Yeah. I don't know either. I mean, as you say that, I was like, that's the most blurry part of
Yeah.
my birth too was after the epidural. But I'm like, is that because I was up for almost 48 hours at that point?
Right.
But it's also the drugs. Like, I don't know. So it's a quick question. But as you're saying that, I was like, yeah, I get very blurry right when that
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah, it was weird. Like and then the epidural wore off. And I was like pressing that button, like more, more. And like it wasn't giving me any relief. So I was like, I told the nurse, I was like, listen, like I'm not getting any relief from hitting the button. She's like, well, it may have worn off. So they got the anesthesiologist and he came and gave me another one. And I was like, oh, okay, this is much better. Like I'm feeling better. But then the haze started to like kind of get there. And then they came into my room. I want to say like, it was probably like 1 p.m. and they're like, all right, we're ready to push. And I was like, all right, it's happening. Cue up my Britney Spears playlist. Here we go. Like listening to all of my jams. And we were pushing for like, I would say I was pushing for about an hour and a half at this point. And they're like, we can see the hair. We can see her hair. She's got a full head of hair. And I was like, oh, that's so exciting. This is awesome. They're like, it's going great. And one of the doctors came in and she's like, all right, let's go. You got this. You got this. Let's keep pushing. And I was like, okay, cool. And like, I started pushing for like another half an hour and I turned to Brandon and I was like, she's not coming. I didn't know it was a she at this point, but I was like, baby's not coming out. I can just feel it. This baby's not coming out. I've been pushing for an hour and a half. The baby has moved none. Like you see the hair, sure, but nothing's happening. So then at like another hour and a half of pushing, and like at this point, like this is what we were talking about before, like because I was in such a haze from the epidural, I was like, am I not pushing hard enough? Like, am I not doing it? Am I not doing it right? Like, am I not pushing? Like, I can't feel it because I'm so, numb and like, maybe I just am not pushing hard enough. And so I kept asking them, like, should I push in a different way? Should I change position? It was really disconcerting too, because one of the nurses that was there, she was her first day in that hospital because she was a traveling nurse. We get a lot of traveling nurses here in Flagstaff. And she was like in the middle of me pushing, like asking the other nurse that was with her questions about the hospital. I'm like, this is not the time, right? Like, this is not making me feel good. I'm not enjoying this experience. Like, they were nice people, but it was still like, come on, this is so inappropriate, right? So anyway, at 3 hours of pushing, the doctor comes in and she's like, all right, you got this, you got this. I'm like, nope, I don't, I'm done. I need a C-section. She's like, no, I think you should keep pushing. And I was like, I'm not pushing anymore. Like, and I, as like hazed as I was, I remember adamantly being like, I'm done. I'm done. My epidural is wearing off. I can feel it again. I'm starting to feel these contractions again. I'm not doing this anymore. And she kept fighting me on it. And Brandon finally stepped in and was like, enough. We're going with the C-section. This is our decision. We are okay with this. We understand. And this was the point where she was like, by any chance, are you a runner? And I was like, absolutely not. I am definitely not a runner. And she's like, because you kind of have like a narrow pelvis. And I think it was a pelvis. We think she's like getting stuck because there's just not enough room for her to get through. And I was like, okay, so that is something that's probably important to say like an hour and a half ago. And like, hey, this might be a little bit tough. She's like, well, in Flagstaff, like a lot of people want vaginal births. Like, we just don't want you to be feeling like we're pressuring you into a C-section. And I was like, yeah, I don't feel that way. Like, just get me in there. So they finally are like, okay, it sounds good. Like, we'll wheel you back there, whatever. But like I said, my epidural had worn off. So I'm feeling everything and I am in a lot of pain. And they go to wheel me to the OR and they are, I'm not kidding you, bumping into every single wall. And I'm like, you guys, like, this is horrible. And Brandon finally steps in. He's like, do you guys want me to help you? Like, I was like, Brandon, did I imagine that? Like, did they actually bump into every wall? He's like, oh, they were horrible. Like, I don't know if they've ever walked a hospital bed before. Like, it was incredible watching them steer this thing. Like, they were panicking. And I was like, okay, I didn't imagine that. Cause I would hit something and I'd be like, oh my God, like just grunting and making all these noises. It was so funny.
What was
not funny, but
what was the time lapse between you saying I want the C-section and when you got wheeled back?
Yeah, so I want to say it was at least an hour between me saying I want the C-section and them actually getting me into the OR. And Brandon had made a comment that he'd heard another girl who was going into the OR, and she was like, he's like, she was screaming, like in agonizing pain, and like, you at least weren't that bad. I was like, oh, gee, thanks. But yeah, it was a while. And they were like, well, we can't give you another epidural because we're going to have to give you the drugs once we get into the OR. And so like I said, like, you know, bumping into all these walls with no drugs. And then we get into the OR, and I just remember it felt like it was 30 degrees in there. I was shaking violently. I got so cold. Yeah. So then they brought in the guy to administer whatever drugs they are that they do. And he kept being like, you're not hunching your back enough for me to put this in. If I don't put this in right, this could really mess you up. And I'm like, okay, again, like, can we talk about bedside manner with these people? Like, this is so not okay. So he finally gets it in, and I lay down on the bed, and I'm starting to realize, like, oh my gosh, I have no feeling in my legs. He paralyzed me. And I literally, like, I was like, I'm paralyzed. I like started screaming to everybody, and they're like, oh no, you're supposed to feel that. I'm like, again, let's prepare me for this, right? Like, tell me, hey, your lower body is going to go numb. That's what's supposed to happen so that the C-section isn't violently painful for you. Yeah. Okay, great. That would have been great to tell me. Right. So we're good. We're like
we
in
talked
there.
about this at one point in telling your story, but I always had it in my head that the epidural that everybody just talks about, the epidural, I always thought that epidural numbed you from the waist down, or from, you know, wherever they put the injection. So when you told me the story for the first time, I was like, well, yeah, isn't that what happens all the time? So again, just naive non-mom over here. I had no idea that that's not what happened.
I didn't know either.
Wait,
I didn't know that either.
So explain an epidural then, because I totally thought that, and I guess, you know, so I was grateful for you giving the disclaimer that like your legs go numb in the C-section, because I knew that once I was in the OR, I was like, oh, Lisa said this was going to happen.
Good. Okay, good.
But
man,
I guess I don't understand then what an epidural is. Because
I mean, Michelle, maybe you can explain it. Like, basically, like it's basically like a crazy painkiller, in my opinion. That's kind of what it was. Like, you basically are like, you can feel the tightness of the contractions, but you don't feel the pain. Like, it's not like pain. It's like if you were high and you're kind of like in this daze, and you can't really feel your body, you know, like, and you start talking. I think I was talking slower. Like, I'm starting to talk slower right now, like remembering being in that. Like,
did they put the shot in the same spot?
I think so. Yeah, in the spine.
It might be a different part of the spine.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
Right. You know, from my understanding too, I think, like, I don't know the science of this too, right? I think it's like a nerve block. So I think a lot of people do experience maybe not paralyzation where you can't move things, but a ton of numbingness of pain.
Yeah.
That's probably the difference of it.
Totally.
So, like, you can't feel the pain, but you can move your legs.
Yes.
Although I have had people who their whole right side went numb or almost paralyzed. Like, it can also do a lot of things as you go through it. So it is more of like an anesthesia, and it does work wherever they inject it downwards. So it numbs the pain, but you can still like have some mobility to it from my experience.
Yeah, unless they give you too much and then you're not able to move. So it's on the dosage. And then also I'm going to throw in the disclaimer, we're not doctors. So if you have questions, ask your doctor or your pediatrician. We're just
don't ask
chatting.
the pediatrician. The pediatrician won't know.
You're right.
The OB might know, but
the OB, thank you.
It doesn't block pain at all. So, you know, whatever.
Yeah, I think an epidural is just an injection in the spine. Like, I'm pretty sure that's just a blanket term for an injection in the spine. But yeah, I'm sure the type of epidural that they give you depends on the outcome that you're trying to achieve, right? Like, if you just need to numb,
that makes sense.
the area to but still have the function to push. Because that's the other thing that never made sense to me. I'm like, all right, so they give you anesthesia in your spine and then you go numb, but how can you push? How can you feel? Like, how can you have control enough to push? So you guys are connecting a lot of dots that I didn't know needed to be connected. But
that's why I was saying, like, I felt like maybe I wasn't pushing hard enough because I couldn't feel well enough. Like I couldn't feel my body and couldn't feel like I controlled my body well enough with the epidural. Yeah. But then when I got to the OR and then I got that drug, that it was like my mind was still cloudy from the epidural. But then my body was completely like, they didn't let me walk to the OR because they must have given me a big enough dose that they're like, yeah, you're not going to walk. And I was in a room pretty far from the OR. I mean, we'll talk about it when we get to Aubrey's birth, but like, I wasn't that far, but I was far enough that they didn't want me to walk. So we get in and the C-section, like, I don't remember Hannah's C-section like at all. I remember Brandon watched the whole thing. Like, he watched over the curtain. Brandon's 6'3". He can see over that curtain pretty easily. And he watched the whole thing. And I'm like, isn't that gross? I mean, he loves that kind of stuff. But I remember Hannah came out and he was like so choked up. And then they got her out and they're like, they made a comment about, oh, shoot. Like not, oh, shoot, but like they kind of said like, oh, we need to repair that. And Brandon's like, repair what? And they were like, don't worry about it. And he's like, well, that's my wife. I'm kind of worried about it, you know? And they're like, why don't you go over with the baby? And then, you know, we'll talk to you in a minute. And like, they brought her over and like did her measurements and everything. And he was with her. And like, he did tell me it was a girl. Like, I was like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. You know, whatever. It was awesome. But, they brought her over and put her like, you know, because like the curtain's like above your breasts and like, so just on top of like where I'm your collarbone, and they put her on there and I was like so dazed. I like remember her being there, but I also like was like, this is really awkward. Like she's going to fall. Like, let's not hold her here. You know, I was worried about her, but they took her and they're like, all right, Dad, why don't you go back to the room with baby and we're gonna sew her up and fix her up and you we'll bring her back in a bit. And he was like, well, I don't want to leave my wife. Like if something's wrong, I want to be here. And they're like, she's fine, it's totally fine, don't worry about it. Like in just like Danielle said, like, do I stay with my wife or do I go with the baby? And they're like, she's fine. And he was like, you know, I'm sitting in the room with Hannah and I'm like, when are you coming back? Like the minutes kept ticking by and you weren't coming back. And I'm like, what's happening? And realistically it was 45 minutes. It wasn't like that long, but it was long enough where he was like worried, and that's not his nature either to worry. So it was like, finally I got back and I, you know, it was like, I was under drugs for a while. Like it took a long time for it to wear off where I could like feel my legs and I could get up and like do stuff. I don't think I got up for a long time, like at least a day. I think I stayed in bed, but I just remember like the drugs wearing off and I was like, this is really, really painful. I'm in a lot of pain. I am not enjoying this at all. And you know, Hannah came out and she had a hematoma so badly on her head that it essentially doubled the size of her head on one side. So it was like this huge lump. Like she had like a camel lump on her head. And I was like, I did that because I kept trying to push her and she's just ramming up against my bone. And I like, again, like you look at it and you're like, I feel so bad. Like I knew she wasn't coming out after an hour and a half, 2 hours of pushing. Like I should have said right then, like, let's end this. Let's end this. My poor baby. Like, is she ever going to have a normal head? You know, like this is so traumatizing to see. And then, you know, they start doing tests with her and they're like, oh man, her jaundice levels are sky high. Like the pediatrician came in and was like, I'm worried. Like this is scary. And I was like, what? Like, what are we talking about here? Like, we need to get her under the Billy light immediately. So she goes under the blue light, you know, and she had the blue light on her. And I mean, she was fine. Like now I know that. And, it took a while for me to know that, but her hematoma, essentially, right? A hematoma is just like blood that pooled. And that's basically why they said she was on the Billy Light for so long, was because the blood was all going up there and not letting her body kind of regulate and get everything in order. So, so that was kind of scary. That was scary because, she was my first kid. I had no idea about jaundice. I'd never heard about it. Like we said, I didn't do much research, and the pediatrician that we had didn't help me to have comfort and ease in that. And I now realize she just wasn't the right fit for us pediatrician wise. Like we had another pediatrician after that, because for some reason she had like the day off or something. He's like, oh, I'm not worried about this at all. And I was like, oh, that's awesome to hear, right? Like I wish we would have heard that sooner. So then we like, I was having issues on my left side when we got home, and I was like, something doesn't feel right. Like
what was the thing they had to fix?
Yeah, that was my question.
That's what I'm about to get to.
Okay.
So I was like, something's feeling like more intense on my left side. And I called the doctor because I was like, I know I'm supposed to be in pain, but I am in serious, serious pain. And even with the painkillers, like this isn't feeling great. And I'm super anxious. And this isn't like, something's wrong. And they're like, why don't you come in? We just want to check and make sure like you're not bleeding or anything like that. And so I get there and I see I think she's a PA. So I see the PA and she's like, hold on a second. I got to run out of the room and ask the doctor if you're the one I'm thinking about. And I was like, what does that mean? So she comes back in and I'm like, am I the one you're thinking about? Because I'm the one that had that weird thing happen that you guys had to patch up. And she's like, yeah. So I think they like cut through I think Brandon said like a tendon, and they had to reattach it. So some kind of lining on my left side got unattached, and they're not clear when that happened, if that happened in the surgery or before, but I was having that pain before I went into labor. And I thought it was just because I was walking too much, but I must have torn something and I didn't realize it. So they're like, you know what, we're going to send you back to the hospital to go get a scan, because we want to make sure that like we sewed everything up right and everything's okay. So I get into the hospital and they take me to go get, I think, is it an MRI when they like inject you with the dye?
I think.
CAT scan. Okay.
A CAT scan? Okay.
It was a CAT scan for your head. Is it for your
You
body?
can do full body for either.
Okay. So they do the whole dye thing, and I was like, you guys, I'm getting really hot after that injection. Oh yeah, that's normal. That's normal. I said, okay. And then I was like, oh my God, I'm getting so cold. I'm so cold. They're like, yeah, that's normal. So they put me in a wheelchair and they wheel me back up to labor and delivery. And I'm like, it was a far wheelchair ride. And I'm like, we're getting closer and I'm like, something's wrong. And I like start talking and I'm like, I'm not talking right. And I said to the guy, I said, hey, I think I'm having an allergic reaction. He's like, what do you mean? I said, I feel like my eyes are really puffy and my throat is starting to swell. And he turns and he like walks around the wheelchair. He looks at me and goes, oh my God. And I was like, what's happening? And he's like, it's okay. And he's like running me at this point to labor and delivery. And he gets to the nurses station. He's like, nurses. Like he's freaking out. I'm like, this is not okay. Something's wrong. And they're like, oh my gosh, and I was like, oh boy, what's happening? So I was like, I've had this once before. I was like, I'm having an allergic reaction, aren't I? Something's bad. And we could post the picture of my face, but I blew up and my throat started to swell. And we found out that I was allergic to the dye. But they were like, yeah, we're just going to inject you with some Benadryl in your butt. And I was like a shot in my butt cheek. And I was like, okay, like, is that like all we can do? Like, is this going to happen fast enough or is my throat going to like completely swell? And they're like, no, you'll be all right. It's all right. And I'm like, okay. So then they do that and they're taking my blood pressure. My blood pressure is skyrocketing. And I'm like, oh yeah, I mean, I have an allergic reaction. I'm freaking out, right? Like this is totally normal. Okay, whatever. And they're like, yeah, you're going to need to stay overnight. And I immediately burst into tears. And I was like, I can't be away from my baby. I can't be away from my baby. They're like, oh, no, you can bring your baby. So Brandon left. He's like, you're going to be okay. I was like, yeah, I'm at the hospital. Like what can go wrong here? They can save me. So he went home and got Hannah and brought her back. And they got me into a room and they're like, yeah, we don't know what's going on with your blood pressure. Like it's just really high. And I was like, okay. So they kept me overnight to observe and they kept seeing like, yeah, it's not coming down. Something's going on. So they brought the doctor in and the doctors that came in and he was like, it's rare, but you have preeclampsia after birth. And that's very rare for that. I mean, it doesn't happen that often. He's like, and I'm going to have to give you a magnesium drip. And I was like, okay, whatever you need to do. He's like, and I was like, so when can I go home? And he turns to me and he goes, listen, you could have a stroke or a seizure. And I was like, wait, what are we talking about here? Like, why are we jumping to this? He's like, your blood pressure is dangerously high. And if you go home, you could stroke or have a seizure. And I was like, I literally wasn't like, hey, let me go home. I was just saying, what's your estimation of when I can go home? And he was like, so then I freaked out even worse, right? Like that was really, really scary. So they give me the magnesium drip and all I can say about that is like, my head was pounding for 24 hours. You're on the magnesium drip for 24 hours. My head was pounding. I felt like I was drunk. I was so miserable. Like I was so miserable. And I was like, this is what birth is. Why do people do this? This is horrible. I was so miserable, but I was in the hospital, I think for another 4 days after that. And that ended up being like, I think that was close to like, it was like 3 to 5 days after I'd been released from the C-section. And the C-section, I was in the hospital for 3 days for that. 4 days, I think, 3.5 days. They released me 3.5 days. But, it was a wild ride. Like, and I was in so much pain for so long. Like at 6 weeks, I finally was like, okay, I'm like, I can function now. But I was just getting to the point of functioning at 6 weeks. And I was like, am I ever going to feel normal again? Like this is, I was on the painkillers, I think, for 2 weeks. And then I was like, I need to get off of these. I'm afraid I'm going to get addicted to them because I could feel how great I felt when I was on them. And I was like, yeah, I don't want to keep going with this. Like, these are great. I love these, So, yeah. So that, and the recovery was really hard with Hannah. Like I just really, really struggled with it. It was tough. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, first I was going to say, like, I just think it's fantastic you advocated for yourself when you're like, something feels wrong.
Yeah.
And like, just imagine if, all of us are guilty at some point of just toughing it out. And like, I remember having some weird headaches or like floater things afterwards. And I just was like, I don't want to disturb the doctor on duty. Like you just feel like this notion of guilt, which is just so silly when it's so like, bad. That's their job. Make the call. Anyways, you made the call and you advocated for yourself and you found out something very, very serious. And you just were navigating such an extreme health issue for 4 days. Like that is 4 to 5 days. That's a significant amount of time. But layered on top of this, you also have a newborn that's days old. How did you navigate the newborn portion of it in addition to your health?
A newborn that's days old that is also dealing with some health complications, right?
Yes.
She was on the Billy light.
Yeah. Yeah.
That poor child, man, they stabbed her in the foot so many times, like drew so much blood from her. Like it was crazy, but she was a champ. I mean, she really she hardly cried when she got poked until like a little bit later on, but like she just like, it was amazing. But we got to the point where I had the allergic reaction and I was like, all right, do I need to not breastfeed her then? Because am I going to pass something to her? Like, so then the lactation consultant was like, I don't know the answer. So let's give her donor milk until we can figure it out. You're going to pump to try to keep your, milk going. And I'm going to try and find out. So she called the like Lactation Consultants of America, like the head office, to make sure that I was going to be okay, or that Hannah would be okay if I kept giving her milk. And she found out that, yeah, it would be fine. She's going to be fine. You can go back to breastfeeding, which was great because like I needed that. Hannah being on me gave me comfort. Like I was like, I'm providing for her, even though I'm breaking down and I'm having a horrible time. I know that like she needs me and I need her this way. And it was what I needed at the time. Right. And I got released from the hospital and we went home and I was on a bunch of beta blockers to try and get my blood pressure to come down. Like it was safe enough that they could send me home, but it was still concerning. And so I got home and I didn't know it for like a few weeks because this went on for a while. Like I had to take my blood pressure 3 times a day. And like, if it was high, I had to take like an extra beta blocker. It was like kind of like, but I also knew when the beta blocker wasn't working because I would get so irritable and I wanted to rage. Like I wanted to scream at everybody and everything. And it was really crazy. I feel for people who have high blood pressure because I don't know if they all feel that way when they get their blood pressure going high, but it was hard.
Did you have any other side effects, like being really dizzy or?
I got headaches. I had headaches too. Yeah. The headache and the pain, my pain, I think was increased because of it. Yeah. And I we talked about this before. You get concerned about what you're putting in your body when you're breastfeeding. And I'm like popping pills like crazy, like I have to get my blood pressure down. So I'm on beta blockers. I've got painkillers. I've got ibuprofen. I've got all this stuff going through me. And I'm like, surely they wouldn't let me do this if it was going to be an issue for the baby.
Do they think there was any connection between the allergic reaction and the high blood pressure at all?
No, none at all. I asked them about that and they were like, no, you literally, you just have preeclampsia. And I was like, that's crazy. Like I've never heard of that for somebody after having the baby. So that was interesting. So yeah, I think, it was, I was super lucky. Hannah started sleeping through the night really early on and I was still dealing with all my pain and issues. And she was a champ. I was lucky, that's probably why Aubrey exists because Hannah was so easy, but Hannah was on the Billy Light for 3 weeks and they kept calling us. The rental company of the Billy Light kept calling us and be like, hey, can you return this? We need this for other patients. I was like, listen, I'm not just holding on to this when you're charging me daily for this just to hold on to it because I like blue lights, she legitimately needs this. And they're like, we've never seen anybody on the Billy Light that long. Like, again, like people and the things they say, you're like, well, that doesn't make me feel good, right? Like that was rough. And we had to keep going. We had to go to the pediatrician a lot to try to make sure that she was regulating so that she didn't have to go back into the hospital. So they were just poking her like crazy, the poor thing. But she turned out fine. And like I said, the hematoma lasted probably, I would say almost 6 months. Like it was humongous. It doubled her head on the one side. And then it went down. And then eventually you're like, oh yeah, she's normal-ish. Like I still now feel it to try and feel if you can feel it being uneven, but she's fine. She's normal. She's good. She's a smart little cookie. So luckily, and that's where we were talking about, I beat myself up oh, could I have done something differently? And I should look at that experience and be like, no, you couldn't have. She wasn't coming out.
Mm-mm.
I have to just get to that point where I say, yeah.
Yeah, I find that amazing. Your intuition, your mother gut or whatever you want to call it, you knew. You're like, no, we're done pushing and got to go to a C-section. And it's a good thing that you did and that you advocated for that because, yeah,
who knows how long we would have been there. Yeah, and she would have been worse off. Who knows what could have happened to her? I hate to think. I don't know. Who knows?
Her heart,
but
her heart rate and everything was remaining stable while you were pushing, or
Yep. Never an issue. They were never worried about her, so that was good. She came out and she was 8 pounds, and I was like, "You are big." She was tall too, and I mean, like I said, my husband is tall, and so it wasn't surprising. But yeah, so fast forward to getting pregnant with Aubrey, it was like all right, so am I going to go down to Phoenix and try and VBAC? Am I going to try and have a vaginal birth after having a C-section? And of course, like, again, didn't know that this existed, but in my head, I was like, well, could I? Should I try that? And then the 20-week scan came that it was placenta previa, that I had placenta previa. And it was like, oh yeah, you cannot have a vaginal birth with placenta previa. Yeah.
What is placenta previa?
So placenta previa is the placenta attaches low in the uterus. So it completely covered the opening of my cervix. So it can cause severe bleeding in the mother before, during, or after delivery. And the placenta is an organ that develops inside the uterus during pregnancy. Basically, if it comes out first, you could severely bleed, and it would be very dangerous for both of us. More so for me than for the baby. But I mean, of course, there's a risk for the baby as well. And like, when I found that out, I went into a tailspin of like, oh my gosh, is she okay? I didn't know she was a she, but is the baby okay? Like, and then I started to be like, well, what if I die? Like, and I'm going to have 2 kids that aren't going to know me. It was a panic, but it was also like probably the best thing that could have happened to me, because that eliminated I can like have a VBAC. I can have a vaginal birth after a C-section. Like, I can't, it's not even an option. Let's just take that off the table. And that probably is the best thing that happened, so that I didn't have to try and go through that again, because there's probably not a baby coming out of me based on my experience with Hannah. So placenta previa, they don't want you to go into labor. So we were told that we were going to have the baby we were going to have her at 36 weeks. And then at the scan at 35 weeks, they were like, oh my gosh, your placenta previa is gone. Holy cow, that's amazing. And I was like, what? So they pushed me back to 39 weeks to have her at a scheduled C-section. So the night, like, and of course, like, the fear is like, oh, you're gonna go into labor before the scheduled C-section, and then they're gonna have to do a C-section quickly, whatever. So I lost my mucus plug, which I hadn't lost with Hannah, and that was at 36 weeks, and I was like, uh-oh, I'm gonna go into labor soon. This is scary. I did not go into labor. We stayed in a hotel the night before we were going into the hospital, because we had to be at the hospital at 5 a.m. for surgery at 7 a.m. And we went to a hotel so that Hannah could stay in her own bed, and my in-laws came and stayed with her. So we get to the hospital at 5, and we're like going through all the motions. I'm like super excited. Everybody's told me scheduled C-sections are amazing. You go into the OR, they take the baby out. It's just a scheduled surgery. So I was like, oh, that sounds amazing, right? No issues. I have no issues. It's going to be great. I feel great. So we get into the room, and I'm like, this room is tiny compared to the room I had with Hannah. What is the deal with this? And they're like, oh, if you don't labor, we don't give you the big rooms. That's for the people that like are going to actually have the baby, like, go through this whole process. You get the little room. I'm not kidding you. Like, the foot of the bed, like, touches the wall. Like, you can't even walk past it. You're like the outcast. I think the window was like boarded up with like wood. Like, it was ridiculous. The bed I was in was like one of those beds that they like, it like keeps making the noise and like having the air so that it adjusts so you don't get bed sores. And I was like, this is really unenjoyable. And they're like, oh, none of the other beds on this wing have that. I wonder why this bed's like that. I'm like, can you move me rooms? Like, this is terrible. You're treating me like a second-class citizen. I hate this.
Like Harry
but
Potter
anyway.
under the stairs.
Yes. Yeah.
Get the broom closet.
Right. So they get me all like prepared for surgery, and they're like, all right, we're ready to go. And I was like, awesome. So I just like lay back in the bed, and they're like, okay, get up. And I was like, what? I get to walk there? Because like, when you have a scheduled C-section, they haven't given you any drugs. So I was like walking to the OR, which was directly across from my room. And I'm like, this is so weird, so different than my experience. And we're excited. And, took a quick selfie before we went in. And we get in and they have these two people who are like the sanitizing people. And they're like, don't touch them. Don't touch them. Whatever you do, don't touch the blue people. And I was like, okay, I won't touch the blue people. And there was a student and she was in there and they screamed at her because she got too close to the blue people. But I'm completely conscious and like aware of everything happening. Whereas with Hannah, I was in such a daze. So they get me on the table again. It's like 35 degrees in that room. And I'm like so cold. And they're like, oh, do you want a heated blanket? I'm like, well, you didn't offer this to me with Hannah. This is amazing. Look at this experience. I'm at the hotel. This is awesome. Bring me a glass of champagne. So I get on the table and the anesthesiologist guy, he was awesome. Like he was like super dry humor. Like we were chatting it up. He's like, all right, tell me when you start feeling this, that. If you start feeling nauseous, let me know. I'll give you some drugs to do the anti-nausea. And I was like, oh, I'm going to throw up. And he like immediately injected me with something. The nausea went away. It was awesome. So I'm laying on the table while they're all like preparing. And I'm talking to the doctors like about like things going on in our town, like nothing's happening. And the doctor finally goes, all right, we got to get this baby out. You got to stop talking. And I was like, oh, okay, it's time, whatever. So, now I'm prepared that I'm going to be paralyzed for a little bit. And so Brandon's like watching over the curtain and he at one point goes, and I was like, what? And he's like, nothing. It's totally fine. I'm like, don't do that. Cause all I can see is you. Right. But this time I could feel them. Like they were like pulling me apart and I could feel the pressure of it. And I was like, that feels not enjoyable. Like I'm not enjoying, like I'm not in pain, but like they feel like they're yanking and they can't yank hard enough. And it's just a weird feeling. But then I don't think it took 20 minutes, like maybe 20 minutes. And they pulled Aubrey out and Brandon was choked up and he was like, it's another girl. And, we both were like, wait, we were both in shock, right? We were sure it was a boy, but so then they went over and like, she cried right away, which was awesome compared to Danielle. Man, I can't imagine that. That would be terrifying. Yeah. Everything was great. And they went back to the room and they wheeled me back to the room and it was like, that was it. Like it was easy breezy compared to Hannah's. And then we, I was like ready to be in agonizing, excruciating pain like I was with Hannah. And I was like, I feel really good. Like this is like, when are these drugs going to wear off? Something's like, this is too good. So then like I want to say like, we slept through the night and we woke up and I was like, I feel good. Like we should go for a walk around the floor. And they're like, I'm not sure. Like that's really rushing it. And I was like, no, I want to do it. And I'm like doing laps and I like turned my watch on to do a workout and I like went a mile and I was like, yeah, like I feel great. And they released me the next day, which is not common for C-section. So Aubrey was born probably around like 9:30 in the morning. And then the next day I was like at like noon, I was like, yeah, I'm ready to go home. Like, let's go home.
Yeah. I was going to tell a quick story about the moment we knew that Aubrey came.
Yeah.
So I was actually sitting in this room with my window right here. And I'm on a work call or jam into an Excel document. And like, you're all I can think about at this point. Like I knew you were in your C-section. I at one baby shower I was given this birthing warrior candle. And it was a kind of a really nice touch. I have it lit here, but I'm like focused on Excel to distract myself. And all of a sudden I get this banging knock on the window and I freak out. I'm like, who the heck is at my window? And sure enough, it is Brandon's dad. And the joy on his face to be like, we have another grandchild. You know, her name, which we all thought was going to be Nora,
Yeah.
is Aubrey. And I'm so excited. And he's like showing me the text message, and he's like jumping for joy in the backyard, and the dog's freaking out. It was just such a beautiful, beautiful moment. So like, you know, while you're going through that all at the hospital, and to get that knock on my window, it was like I had opened it like a drive-through
Yes.
to see Brandon's dad, and it was really cool.
Yeah, it was crazy. Like I said, I felt so good, and like I was like, yeah, like I'm ready to be released, and the doctor's like, okay, let's go. Like, so they released me the next night, and we came home and surprised Brandon's parents and Hannah, and they were like, what are you doing home so early? Because their daughter had 3 C-sections, and they always were in the hospital for 2 days. I was like, I was feeling great. Like, this is awesome. We're so great. We get home, and Hannah meets Aubrey and immediately adores her and is like, wants to hold her. It was very sweet. And then like probably 3 days later, I was like, oh no. Brandon's like, what's going on? I was like, my blood pressure's high again. He's like, how do you know? I said, the anxiety that I'm having and that feeling, like, it's not good. And he's like, get the blood pressure cuff out. I'm like, I don't want to. And he's like, you need to. So I took it, and it was high, but it wasn't high like it was with Hannah. And I was like, okay, all right, well, you know, I'm going to let it go. Let's sleep, you know, let's sleep the next night, and let's take it again. We took it in the next morning, and it was worse. And I was like, all right. Brandon's like, I think we should call the doctor. And I was like, nah, like, let's just get through the day and like see what happens. And that night I took it before I went to bed, and it was like really bad. And I was like, let's just go to bed. And Brandon's like, you could have a stroke.
Mm-hmm.
You could have a stroke tonight. Let's not do that. Let's call the doctor on call and see what happens. And the doctor on call was like, come in. And I was like, oh, man, I don't want to go through this again. And so we get there, and I'm like, all right, well, if I can at least avoid the mag drip again, I'm going to be all right. Like, it'll be all right. And so they monitor me for 24 hours, and they're like, it's not coming down. We need to mag drip you to make sure we preserve your organs. It makes sure, like, it essentially makes it so that your organs don't shut down on you. And I was like, they're like, warned me. They're like, all right, I don't know if you remember. And I hadn't remembered. And they're like, you're going to feel really drunk, and you're going to probably get a headache. And I'm like, okay. And they let me obviously have Aubrey with me because I was breastfeeding her. And I was like, I can still breastfeed her through this, right? And they're like, yep, you can do that. And so they mag dripped me, and I was like, oh man, I was like seeing double. It was awful. And I was in the hospital. I think I was in the hospital for 4 days with this one, with this preeclampsia again. And then I started to get like these horrible, like pains that would double me over. Like it was horrible. And so I was like trying to walk, because it was essentially like I was constipated, but the way I get constipated is I get violent pains, like in my, like below my stomach. And I was like, this can't be normal. And they're like, yeah, it's normal. And like, there's nothing worse, I don't think, than them telling you that this excruciating pain that you're feeling is normal, and you just have to wait it out. And I'm like, I'm not normal. This is not normal. I know this is not normal. But it ended up like, I then started walking the labor and delivery just to try to get myself to go poop, because it was like so excruciating, the pains that I had. And I had that lingered for probably 3 weeks before it finally went away. But honestly, after that, like, I was great. Like, my recovery, I still can't believe my recovery from Aubrey was so fast and so good. Like, Aubrey was a breeze. The whole birthing process was a breeze with her. Yes, it stunk. I got preeclampsia again, but that's not, that's my body. And then, yeah, just amazing how quickly I recovered on this one. I can't believe it. So that was long-winded.
Have you had any other issues with blood pressure outside of the preeclampsia?
Nope. I actually used to have low blood pressures. Yeah. So it was surprising, but I talked to my mom, and my mom said about this age to like 40, she started to go on full-time blood pressure medications. And I'm like, oh man, I really hope that that's not in my future of like always. And I remember growing up with her having bad blood pressure because she would always yell at us and be like, you guys are raising my blood pressure. Like, you're going to make me have a stroke. It's like, she was like legit. Like, she literally could have based on us, but yeah, crazy.
One of the other things I was shocked by is that, you know, it wasn't until after you came back from the hospital that you didn't go back to labor and delivery. Like, you went to the regular, you know, emergency room and hospital, which for
I
me
didn't.
was just,
No, I went to
Yeah.
labor and delivery. I was in labor
you
and
did?
delivery. Yep.
Whoa.
Yes.
All right.
And we were super lucky. I forgot to
Okay.
mention that by this point, Brandon's parents had left and my parents weren't coming up yet. Michelle had to come over and stay with Hannah the night that we went back into the hospital because we were like, I can't get my mom up here fast enough because she lives 2 hours away. And I didn't want to wait. I wanted to get the ball rolling. And we were so lucky that Michelle could come over and stay over at our house. It was awesome. Thank you.
You don't even need to mention that.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. So anyway,
In a heartbeat for anyone.
yeah, that was my birth.
Crazy. They're, like I said before you even got started, they're all so different.
Mm-hmm.
So different.
So
different.
Did Aubrey have any jaundice?
Nope. Not at all. I don't, that's so crazy to me. Yeah, that she didn't have it. And you know, what's interesting, when we went back into the hospital for, my preeclampsia, the nurse was like, she looks really yellow to me about Aubrey. And she's like, you should just run over to the pediatrician and have them check it out. So we called the pediatrician because they're right across the street from the hospital when I was getting released. And I was like, hey, can we come stop over and get her jaundice levels checked? And they're like, oh yeah, for sure. So we came over and she's like, oh, she's well within normal range. Like, no worries. And I did see a little bit of a yellow tint, but that's kind of like our skin. It's like olivey yellow. So it's, you know, just is what it is. But yeah, no, she was fine. Everything was fine. So that was nice.
And then overall, your recovery period with Aubrey was shorter, easier, less painful.
So much shorter, so much easier. It was so different. And I like, it's literally like stunning how different it was. Like a scheduled C-section, high recommend, 10 out of 10. It was wonderful. It was such a, like we always joke, like I think everybody's episodes, we all called it the hotel, checking into the hotel. Like it literally felt like that. I was genuinely excited to go back to the hospital because I had such a great experience with the nurses and my experience with Hannah. Like I was so excited to go back there. And like, that is actually one of the things that like, I am bummed about not having another kid is not going back to the hospital because they were such amazing, wonderful people. The nurses were, and so helpful in so many different ways. Like one of the nurses, I talked to her, I'm like, you're like neglecting all the other patients. She sat in my room for an hour. We talked for an hour. And she's like, yeah, it's slow in the C-section area right now. Like you're our only person in here. And I was like, oh, cool. Neat.
It's funny you say that because I was going to ask. I remember during your pregnancy with Aubrey, there was a part of you that was kind of bummed about the idea of having a C-section just because you kind of lose the excitement of, oh, I'm going into labor, you know, like it's scheduled, you know, when it's going to happen. So it's kind of funny to hear you say that now, like that it was overall a good experience. So now looking back on it now in hindsight, does it matter? Like, do you even think about that anymore? Or is that feeling, was that just totally fleeting now that it's over and done?
I mean, I was glad I experienced it with Hannah, the going into labor part, but I'll tell you, like, it was actually really funny. And they made me like the night before Aubrey was born, I had to take a shower and then Brandon had to lather me in this like disgusting, I don't even know what it was. Like I called it formaldehyde. It was gross.
Why?
It was not formaldehyde. because it's like supposed to prevent you from getting infection, like a staph infection or some kind of infection. But like you're sitting in this soap naked for 30 minutes while it just does its thing. And then you have to go back into the shower and rinse it off without soap. And I'm like, doesn't that defeat the purpose of whatever I just put on?
Weird.
But it was like such a weird thing. Yeah, it was. I don't know what it was.
I'd never heard of that.
Yeah, me
That's super
neither.
interesting.
It was, yeah.
Did you ever figure out what Brandon's face was for?
Oh, yeah, because he was watching them pull me apart. So he was like the sheer force they were using, he was like, I'm going to stand up and show you. He was like, yeah, so the one lady was like this, like ripping you, and the other lady was ripping you the other way while another person was pulling the baby out. He was like, it was intense to watch how hard they could be on your body. And I had some crazy bruising after Aubrey's, which I was like, oh yeah, I'm sure that makes sense based on how he described it, you know. And they cut on the same scar as Hannah's so that I wouldn't have a second scar. So that was kind of nice because my scar has healed very well. I'm actually wildly impressed that it's as light as it is. So
that was my question. So you just answered that.
Yeah.
Because I was curious. Because like if we get pregnant again, I'm deciding like, do I want to have a C-section or do I want to try a VBAC? And your story makes me like, maybe, you know, it just pushing a baby, like I said, out of my vagina sounds so scary. And then I've done a C-section. I know what to expect, maybe be different. But yeah, the scar. But yeah, you talking about them pulling, that makes a lot of sense. I had a lot of numbness, which is pretty normal. Like you can't feel your skin. I'm like, this feels weird, but it came back. So if you haven't had C-section,
mine took probably, I want to say, like it felt like a year and a half before I wasn't numb anymore on my scar. With Aubrey's, I can feel it, like, or I can feel my skin around it now. Like that's the thing. Like I would get like weird phantom pains with my scar after Hannah. I would get some pretty bad pains, not like Leah describes, but like it would hurt. Like it almost felt like it was like coming back together, you know, like, you know, like when you get a cut and the skin like is stretching and pulling, like I could feel that through my C-section.
Yeah. I've had to call my doctor a few times. I'm like, it felt like it ripped. I sneezed and it's always on my left side. I think that's where they ended the sewing up. And like, it's just scar tissue. It's normal. I'm like, oh my gosh. You say normal one more time.
The worst.
I was like, I sneezed and it ripped. And they're like, it's not ripped. You're fine. But yeah, it's still a little sore on the left side, but all worth it.
Mine on the left side has healed like the doctor expected it to heal, and it's like faded. And so that's what's interesting is like the right side they look like two very different scars. They don't look the same.
Interesting.
You're saying like on the same, you only have one major incision, but on the half of the scar, the left side is, or whatever side is the issue. Interesting. Fascinating.
Well, thanks for. I love listening to your story. Every time when a baby's born, I always get chills, and they're like, and you know, your husband got choked up, and I'm like, oh, I love a good birth story.
Mm-hmm.
And Lisa, I just think yours are so interesting because they're very different, but they also have some mirrored similarities. Like, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. I would not recommend preeclampsia. That's for sure. That's not.
Seriously.
That's not enjoyable. Yeah. I'm glad I didn't have it before, though, like, because I can only imagine the worry I would have being pregnant with blood pressure like that. Like, I know they're quick to, I'm pretty sure they're quick to get the baby out of you early when you have preeclampsia because of fears for your health and the baby's when you're pregnant and have it. So I guess that's a silver lining to that for sure. At least it was just me going through it and not the babies with me going through it. So, yeah.
And that wraps up another episode of Mom Jeans, trying to fit into motherhood. Thank you again so much for listening to us. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please consider giving us 5 stars so other mothers out there like you can find us and listen. If you would like, you could follow us on any of our socials at momjeansthepodcast.com. If you have questions, would like to send us your birth story, or give us suggestions or things that you would like to hear, please email us at hello@momjeansthepodcast.com. See you next week.